I'm honored to be invited to speak here. I hope the session is going well, and I look forward to all your questions. So, as the talk title suggests, I'm going to talk about what we can learn from unstable microbiomes. And I want to start by giving you a little bit of background. I don't think this audience needs this slide really, but just to get everybody on the same page, we know that host microbiome interactions are very, very ubiquitous. They're found everywhere we've searched. And they're very diverse, and very often they're quite important. And here, the slide just from this nice review paper shows or summarizes all the different contexts in which we know that microbiomes can help their hosts in plants specifically. And these kinds of consequences can be even really, really large at the ecosystem level and at the global biogeochemical cycling level as well. So clearly, these kinds of interactions are really important to understand. But even though we keep finding these interactions a lot and we want to understand them better and their functions, there's also a bunch of species that we now know of which don't seem to need a specific microbiome. So this is again a picture I've pulled out of a really nice review from a few years ago, where Tobin and his colleagues, they all put together all the different cases where we actually know that microbiomes are transient. So they're not the kind of stable, nice, sort of, I don't know, to some extent, well-behaved microbiomes that we observed in animals like cows, but instead, these are species or taxa that come and go and that have very often very small abundances, absolute abundances. And the relative abundances also fluctuate a lot. So the composition of the community changes. And a really interesting question in my mind is, what are these kinds of microbiomes? Are they relevant? Are they useful? And what governs whether a particular host is going to have a resident microbiome or a transient microbiome, and under what conditions can we move between these? So these are the broad themes that I want to discuss in my talk today. We do know, of course, that many, many different factors influence colonization. This is again from a very nice review by Ganesan and colleagues. And they have summarized here for bacterial colonization in different kinds of invertebrate systems. What are the mechanisms, the molecular mechanisms that are important? And you can see here things like motility, adhesion, secretion systems, host morphology is being modified, stress responses. And so when I look at this, what I see is not just, okay, here are all the factors that influence whether a colonization event will be successful, but here's where everything can go wrong when it comes to successful colonization, right? And so it's perhaps thinking about all the different steps in addition to these molecular steps, but also ecological steps. You have to find your host as a bacterium. You have to then invade the host. You have to manage not to die in this entire period of time. You have to then colonize, you have to grow, you have to provide something to the host gives you something. Then you go out into the world and disperse and find a new host again. All of this seems extremely difficult to achieve. And so, in some sense, I'm now starting to think, well, how do any symbioses get established at all at the beginning, right? And once they get established, how are they maintained long enough for a nice stable relationship to form and to be able to continue over several generations and several thousands of generations, as we know for many, many beautiful systems. And so, in general, then I'm thinking maybe it's not that surprising that these kinds of transient microbiomes may perhaps be more common than we realize. One manifestation of this kind of loose relationship between host and microbe is the intraspecific variation in host microbiomes, which is well known now in many, many taxa. And this is just an example of a fly species where a small, relatively small change in the microbial composition can lead to a really big shift in the sexual mate choice behavior of these individuals. And so we know that this kind of intraspecific variation is rampant, but we also know that sometimes it can have large consequences for how this population and this species is going to behave and survive and persist. So what I want to do today then is go through a set of different studies that my lab has done in the last few years, where, as it turns out, we have stumbled upon many of these weird systems, which no longer seem weird to me, but they were weird when we started off, where the microbiome is seemingly unstable and does not seem to do much in many of these cases. So I'll start off with one of the first systems where we started. So about 10 years ago or so, we started working on microbiomes. And I wanted to particularly start thinking about what's happening to microbiomes in systems where the host is in the wild, in nature. Because at least at that point, many of the studies that I was seeing in literature were reporting or discussing microbiomes of systems which could be brought into the lab, and then they were being studied in the lab and dissected in depth in the lab, which of course is valuable. But I was curious what happens in nature because of some of these stochastic factors that I thought might be really important in the wild. And so we started by looking at insects just because we like insects and we have collaborators who we can work with for these insects. So we started looking at microbiomes of butterflies. And the reason we chose butterflies is because we know that they have diverse host plants, they have different stages of their lives which have very different diets. And we thought that the diet may have something to do with the microbiome. So let's start exploring. And I'm showing you here just a little bit of the data we gathered at that point. So we went and collected wild caterpillars of, here I'm showing you two different species, as well as the host plant which they were eating, right? And so what we see here is when we do 16S amplicon sequencing, the standard stuff that everybody is used to doing, what we see is that the microbiome is basically the same between the larvae as well as the leaves which they are consuming, and that's true for the two species I'm showing you here, and this pattern is repeated again and again. We also found that if we look at the adults, there is a lot of individual variation in adult butterflies across different individuals and what microbiomes they have. So it seemed like overall the butterflies have a microbiome which is quite unstable. It changes a lot across individuals, and it doesn't seem to really be filtering. There seems to be no filtering of the microbiome compared to the diet that at least the larvae are feeding on. And we see a similar pattern when we worked with dragonflies. So dragonflies, as you all know, are predators and they hunt, and they're quite generalist overall as far as we know. And so what I expected is, again, because of their very carnivorous lifestyle, maybe they can obtain some useful stuff from microbes in their guts. But when we looked at dragonfly guts for different species of dragonflies collected from different locations in India, we again found that if you fit a simple neutral model of community assembly and ask how many of these different taxa that we identify are their occurrence and abundance across these different samples is consistent with a neutrally distributed a neutral distribution, we find that most of the taxa fall into that category, with very few taxa showing a pattern of distribution that is consistent with positive or purifying selection. And so this again suggested that even in dragonflies, it doesn't seem like there is any particular association with a specific microbiome. But we then also know, and there are several cases now highlighted in this very recent review, which I also really liked, where we know that actually transient microbiomes can be functionally useful for hosts, right? So here's an example of mosquitoes highlighted here, where the different mosquito life stages, larvae in particular, are picking up different microbes as they grow and as they develop. And different mosquitoes, mosquito larvae will end up picking up different microbes depending on the water in which they're hanging out. And so you might think that, okay, well, it doesn't matter then because the microbiome is quite variable and fluctuates a lot. But if you then do experiments where you remove the microbiome, you find that there is, in fact, a really strong dependence of these larvae for development and survival on having a microbiome. It doesn't have to be a specific microbiome, but they need these bacteria to be able to complete their development as scheduled. So there are similar examples of armyworms and then these leaf-footed bugs, which are really fascinating systems where all these microbes that are important are acquired from the environment. And so there's a huge risk factor, if you think about it, that every generation doesn't get anything directly from their parents, but they have to take it from the soil, for example. And then they have to filter for the right bacteria, which are useful for them, and then retain them, put them in specialized organs in some cases, and then obtain benefits from them. So my point in showing this slide is to highlight that, well, we are now coming to the realization that some of these transient microbiomes, which it's tempting to think are not important, could actually be functionally useful. And so it's worth testing in every case that we find these kinds of transient microbiomes, whether there could still be some function that's extracted from them. And so we did these kinds of experiments for the butterflies. So again, we did these experiments for two butterfly species, and both of these feed on plants which are toxic. So Danaus crysippus feeds on milkweeds, which have these sticky latex, extremely toxic. And Ariadne marione, which is a castor butterfly, feeds on castor plant. The leaves are not super toxic, but we expected some toxins to perhaps be important, and we asked well, whether microbes are important. So collected these eggs of these butterflies from our campus where the butterflies are flying around, and we brought them to the lab, fed them antibiotics, and we measured many different aspects of fitness for the larvae as they were growing up. And I'm showing you here just data for how long they took to complete the larval stage of their development. That is the days taken for eclosion. And as you can see here, all of the treatments looked exactly the same. And the same pattern was repeated for other fitness measures as well. So long story short, what we're finding is that when we disrupt butterfly microbiomes for these two cases where I thought surely we're going to find something, we didn't find anything. It's possible, of course, that we missed measuring some particular fitness measure that is actually relevant at a different life stage, perhaps, or something. But I was surprised that there was no effect at all. And so we had these multiple systems then where insects, two systems at least, where we didn't see any effects of the microbiome. And remember, this is a few years ago where there weren't that many other case studies, and I was getting a bit sad about this. So we thought, okay, let's move to, meanwhile, we had a postdoc, Pratibha, who joined the lab, and she was really interested in working with plant-associated microbes. So we went and sampled rice-associated microbiomes in the northeastern part of India, where there are many, many different traditionally cultivated rice land races that have been grown by people for hundreds of generations. And because of this separation of these different varieties, there's a lot of diversity in the rice itself and its phenology. And so we thought maybe the microbes that are living on these leaves may also have differentiated. So I'm showing you data here for the phyllosphere microbiomes. We sampled both epiphytes, which live on the surface of the leaves, and endophytes, which are inside the leaf surface. And we sampled this across 3 different years. And every column here represents one individual plant, one leaf from a plant. And you can again see that the gray, which is the rare taxa, are very abundant in 2019, but reduce over time. And then this pink taxon, which is the genus Methalobacterium, which is a known associate of many of these plants and provide benefits to several different plant species. They also fluctuate up and down quite a bit over time. So this is all data for one of these rice varieties called Chakhao. And I show you here data for another rice variety to drive home that variability is observed in this species, as in this strain of rice as well, but also that the patterns are not identical to what you see in the other rice variety. And so we have data like this from other rice varieties as well, and it's the same pattern again and again. There's a lot of variability across years, across land races, and it's very odd because we had done experiments in the field earlier where we had taken specific Methylobacterium strains that we found on specific rice varieties. And in the field experiment, we either sprayed these rice plants when they were very small with just water or no treatment, or the growth media used to grow the bacteria. Then the Methylobacterium that was isolated from that particular rice variety, which is own, or some random other Methylobacterium, right? And in some cases, we did find that the specific Methylobacterium that we sprayed this plant with, which was isolated from that same rice variety, actually increased grain yield in some cases. And in other cases, it involved improved plant growth and so on. So clearly there were some benefits that the host could acquire from these specific bacteria. And yet there seemed to be no mechanisms in place to be able to consistently and repeatedly acquire these same bacteria from the environment every time these rice plants were grown. We also did experiments asking whether the seeds were able to carry these same strains of Methylobacterium or any other strains, and we don't see that either. So I got a little bit upset and tired and frustrated with all of these systems in the wild where, plants, insects were seeing the same pattern where nothing is stable. And so if you want to work on questions of how these associations evolve and develop, you need to have an association or something to work with. So we decided to turn to the red flower beetle, which we already have in our lab for other experiments. This is a pest species which has been associated with humans and our grain and flour warehouses for thousands of years now. And that's its natural habitat at this point. And so what we can do is we can bring it into the lab where it eats wheat flour very happily, and we can simulate conditions which are very, very close to what it experiences in its natural environment. So in this system, it's nice, and it's a bit controlled, and yet it's a little bit mimicking what's happening in the wild. And so it allows us in a very rapid fashion to go through multiple generations, to do some, if there's an association here with the microbiome of these beetles, we have the ability to do experiments in the lab. We can control things. So I thought, okay, let's look at what's going on here. So in the initial experiments, we did simple experiments where we reduced the load of microbes in the flour by either treating it with UV radiation or administering antibiotics. So this is dry flour in which these beetles live, and they lay eggs there. All life stages grow up there. And so the entire life cycle is contained in a box of flour. Very convenient. And so what we could do then is when we use UV or antibiotics, we should be reducing the flour load, and we confirm that that's the case. And if we ask females to now lay eggs in that flour, we can ask whether their fecundity changes, whether offspring survival changes. And so we measure a large number of different fitness consequences. And what we find is that in general, there are several cases where if you remove the microbes, it's not lethal in general, but there is a fitness advantage to having the microbes around. So for example, here, the offspring are able to survive, many more offspring are able to survive in the control flour compared to the UV treated flour. We see similar results for antibiotics. And in a different study done by other members of the lab at different time period, we again found that if you allow the flour to be treated with UV versus not, you end up altering whether immune memory is formed in terms of being infected by a pathogen, Bacillus thuringiensis, in these same beetles. So it suggested that the flour beetles can benefit from the microbiome, but the interaction is not obligate. So then we wanted to understand, okay, what is the core microbiome? What are the members of these microbiomes that are important? Can we culture them? Can we understand their function? And this is where this whole work was supposed to go. And I guess you know where you can see it's coming. There's an incredible amount of variation in this microbiome. So we went back to the freezer stocks that we had. It's on -80. We had stored over the years many samples of beetles from the same exact stock population, which we had been maintaining in the lab for a long time. And as you can see over the different years of this experiment, where we were able to find old samples in the freezer, we're sampling about 10 females from each population at each time point. And we're asking, what is the microbiome like? And you can see that there are some repeat members. So Enterococcus, Ezachiela, this orange one, they keep coming in and out. But you can see the incredible diversity, both at the level of individuals as well as across time. So microbiome fluctuates a lot. And this is a bit surprising because I just showed you that there are really nice benefits to be had for the host fitness. So what is going on? So effectively, the last 4 to 5 years we've spent on just trying to understand why do we see this enormous amounts of drift, or what seems like drift, in the microbiome, despite what should lead to strong selection to maintain an association. So I want to show you just a quantification of the individual variation that I mentioned from the last slide. So here we've just estimated the taxonomic beta diversity. So asking how different are the microbiomes of different individuals, so individual level variation. And the negative numbers indicate low variation, and positive numbers indicate high variation. So what you can see is that over time, the amount of individual variation also fluctuates enormously in this system. And if we measure how much is the total bacterial load normalized to the beetle tissue, so what we do is we use a primer which is amplifying all 16S in each beetle. And we also use a primer which amplifies only a beetle-specific marker DNA, piece of DNA. And so what we can say is per gram beetle tissue, how many bacterial cells estimated do we have, right? And that's what I'm plotting here. What you see is that basically even that normalized total abundance of bacteria in each beetle is also fluctuating over time, as well as it varies within a single population. And so all of this suggests that there is a lot of this drift. And so we initially did experiments trying to ask, okay, could our experimental procedures be changing something, right? So maybe if person A versus person B is doing the experiment, maybe if the flour is exposed to air for very long or not, maybe all of these things. So we did all these experiments to try and tease apart, and basically none of these factors explained a lot of the variation that we were observing. So clearly the variability was coming from within the system, not external to it. It was not a function of, did I wash my hands today 5 times or not, as I did these experiments. So the beetle microbiome in general varied across months and years, across life stages, across replicate boxes, and also between parents and offspring. So every generation, we're observing a shift in the microbiome when we measure it carefully, even in the lab, what is going on. So I want to focus on, I'm not showing you all of the data for all of this at the moment, but I'm going to show you bits and pieces which I think really tell the story well. So the larval microbiome we found assembles very rapidly compared to adults. So in all of this case, everything I showed you so far was adults. We thought we should start looking at other life stages as well. As you can imagine, larvae are eating machines, right? So they are just constantly consuming large amounts of flour. And so maybe we thought they would be better incubators for the bacteria. And that indeed turned out to be the case. So here's the normalized total bacterial load, again, normalized to the larval DNA, as I mentioned before. And you see that across the larval lifestyle stage, the microbial load is really increasing very, very quickly. So within a week, every larva has a ton of bacteria that it is harboring. And the pie charts show you the average abundance of different taxa in these samples of larvae. And you can see that they become very, very quickly colonized by Escherichia strains very, very early on. And so the microbiome is very stable in larvae very, very quickly. In contrast, if you look at adult microbiomes, it takes about 3 weeks for the adult microbiome to stabilize, and a bit after that before the microbial load starts increasing. And what that means is basically adults start reproducing already by 1 to 2 weeks of age. They're mature, and yet their microbiome only stabilizes much later. 3 to 4 weeks in, their first batch of offspring are getting ready to become adults themselves. And so basically an entire generation can go between an adult laying eggs and the next generation coming up, but the first generation adults still don't have a stable microbiome. And so this suggested that maybe that precise timing of when populations are being maintained and moved around and when new populations form may have a role to play. So we wanted to probe this further. And we thought that larval feces, because they have such a high bacterial load, may serve as a good source of inoculum in the flower. Remember, I told you earlier that all these different life stages are in the flower, and they're all eating and pooping, and everything is happening in the same flower. So we created these different mixtures of flour where we added different proportions of fresh flour and used flour. And the used or enriched flour basically means that we allowed some X number of larvae to deposit fecal material in that flour for some fixed period of time, right? And so as we increase the proportion of this used enriched flour in this mixture, we find that the total bacterial load is increasing of the flour itself. It is becoming enriched in Escherichia, and the rare taxa shown in gray are reducing over time. Now, this suggests that larval feces serve as a really important source of bacterial inoculum in the flower. And this is confirmed further when we allow beetles to grow up or to pupate and then eclose from that pupation in these different proportions of enriched flour. And when we do that experiment, we again find that the beetles very quickly have a very Escherichia abundant, dominant microbiome as soon as we have a lot of larval fecal inoculum coming in. And this is also associated with lower individual level variation in these different beetles. And so as you see here, as the amount of larval fecal inoculum increases, the beta diversity across individual beetles reduces as well. And so this suggests that larval feces is a great way to have a stable microbiome. Then why is it not persisting in our system? And we think that the answer is the adults. So adults of these species are well known to secrete antimicrobial compounds called quinones in the flower. And these, of course, then have the ability to reduce the bacterial load in the flower. So we tested this. This is a picture of a dissected flower beetle where you can see these abdominal sting glands, which are yellow. And these sting glands are what continuously release quinones in the flower, and this gets mixed up in the flower. And when we extract sting gland extracts, when we make sting gland extracts, And we test antimicrobial activity of these extracts on petri dishes. Here's just two examples that you see, these big zones of inhibition compared to the control disk, which does not show a zone of inhibition. And so we found that different bacteria, which we isolated from the beetles or from the flour, which has been used by beetles, showed different levels of susceptibility to the quinones. And so what this suggested is maybe the adults are not a good source of fecal material or inoculum because they also release these antimicrobial quinones, which suppress bacterial loads in the flour. And when bacterial loads in the flour are suppressed, ultimately this means that there is less inoculum that goes back into new individuals. And so recolonization is going to be difficult. So to confirm this, we used RNAi, where we injected different pupae with either just buffer or with a GFP control or with double-stranded DNA for a gene which is known to be important in the synthesis of quinones. And so what you can see in these pictures is the first two treatments, which are control treatments, the adults develop normal sting glands, like bright yellow. And in the last one, where we suppress quinone production, the sting glands are empty, so there's no yellow there. And when we measured the total bacterial loads of these different groups of beetles, either control beetles or treated ones, we find that when we suppress quinone production, the total bacterial load in the flour as well as the beetles increases dramatically, right? So basically this suggested that there's this seesaw action going on where larval presence increases microbial load and adult presence suppresses those loads. And so the timing of what's going on in the populations really matters. And then I want to put one final piece of the puzzle in place, where what happens when we do our normal population maintenance in the lab is we replace the used flour with fresh flour periodically because of the flour gets really nasty. It accumulates quinones, it has everybody's poop in it, and so there's very little nutritive content there. And so to keep our populations healthy, we keep supplying fresh flour every once in a while. And what you see here is when we track the total bacterial load in one stock population over a long time, we find that every time we add fresh flour, shown by blue arrows here, the total bacterial load drops, and then the rare bacteria increase, and it takes some time before Escherichia can start colonizing in the flour and in the microbe, in the beetles as well. And so what all of this put together suggests is an important aspect of where drift comes from. I want to show you some more final bit of data here showing that microbiome-associated host fitness benefits are also unstable. So remember I showed you some data earlier saying that Aparna, a PhD student who was in my lab at that point, had measured what happens to fecundity of females when you administer antibiotics in the flour. And what she had found was this stark drop in fecundity when females are given antibiotics. And we were able to replicate this result in 2020, but after that, we have never been able to repeat it. And so effectively what we're seeing is that either due to or as a result of the drift that we are seeing, or because of other reasons that feed back into the same loop, we're finding that the host fitness benefits are also quite unstable. And so both the microbiome and the fitness benefit to the host are all over the place, and none of it is really something that can be very, very consistently observed across time. So what are then the several sources of ecological drift in the flour beetle microbiome? We can break this down to make a simple cartoon model, and we say, okay, inoculation or influx is important. As I mentioned to you before, we interrogated and tested for many different sources of bacterial inoculum in the flour, and we've decided that ultimately it is internal system, is very little influx that comes from the flour itself, and it's the beetles which are important to propagate. These bacteria that are there in the flour then have to survive and persist for some amount of time. They then have to colonize the beetles, and then the process goes back, right? And so what have we observed so far? I didn't show you data, but we don't find any evidence for vertical transmission. So the eggs of these beetles do not seem to contain a significant amount of microbial loads. And so we think that the main influx of bacteria is really the feces of adults and larvae, in particular the feces of larvae, which are really, really enriched in specific good colonizers like Escherichia. This increases the bacterial load in the flour. But every time we change the flower or the adults start developing and adding quinones, and due to desiccation, the bacterial load is going to decrease in the flower. And finally, uh, whatever manages to survive this period is going to go and infect or colonize larvae and beetles. And here, exactly which taxa colonize presumably has something to do with the metabolism, the ecology, and the interactions between these different taxa. This is in a dotted line box because this is something we're still exploring. And so, in the end, what we're finding is basically that there are multiple sources of drift. I want to point out also that this flower change, you might think it's a very artificial, laboratory, contrived regime. But actually, even in the grain warehouses, we think this mimics what happens in there as well, because adults are well known to colonize new habitats and new patches of flower. And it's usually the adults that do it. The larvae will not move around, which means that every time a female beetle goes and identifies a new warehouse, a new sack of grain or flour to colonize, she's effectively again dealing only with a very small inoculum that comes from her own fecal material, which may or may not eventually colonize the larvae that her offspring then develop in that patch. So we think that the flower change is not too much of a stretch in terms of what happens in their natural habitat, and where a big change in the environment effectively gets rid of their entire bacterial inoculum because they're not carrying anything vertically at all. So, what lessons have we learned? We find that in multiple wild host populations, the microbiomes fluctuate a lot. This is also true under controlled laboratory conditions, and I suspect this is more common than at least I realized earlier. And I suspect this also because it seems a little bit too much of a coincidence that all the systems that we decided to work with in the wild show this property, a common property that they all have varying and fluctuating and transient microbiomes with large amounts of individual variation. So my suspicion is that this kind of stuff is far more common than we realize. And the more different systems we explore in the wild, the more such cases we are going to find. Already there are many, many more cases than what I've shown you today. We see that the sources of ecological drift are many and variable, and it's important to consider ecological drift as a really, really important factor that is important to understand how communities of bacteria are assembled and how they can influence host ecology and evolution. And I speculate that this really, really large effect of ecological drift may be also inhibiting the evolution of strong host microbe relationships in some cases, at least. This is what I suspect is true for my beetles, but maybe it's true for other systems as well. And before I end my talk, I want to just highlight a few really big open questions that I find super fascinating, and I hope that some of you would like to take up. Um, to be able to understand how common or what kinds of relationships are common in host bacterial associations, we really need to understand what are the typical bacterial loads in or on hosts as well as in environments. And we don't have a very good handle on this because it's hard to measure, it takes a lot of time and effort and money. But we really need to understand, for example, how many cells are needed to provide, how many bacterial cells are needed to provide a given function for a host that's worth the benefit and the cost that the host is going to have. And so I think we really need to understand what loads are we talking about, because without it, we don't have any hope of really understanding how common are functional benefits despite transient microbiomes. It's also important to understand, to quantify what are the costs and benefits of different modes of transmission of bacteria. We realize and recognize and even have some quantification now of how often each of these different symbiont transmission modes are observed in nature, but we don't know what exactly are the costs or benefits involved. And I speculate that there is some particular cost benefit ratio from the host or the symbiont side, which allows for an unstable but functional symbiosis to form. And a change in that cost benefit ratio should then allow for evolutionary transitions between transmission modes. So, at some point, for example, if the cost of maintaining an unstable but functional symbiosis is too large, maybe the whole system collapses, or the benefit needs to become a bit higher for the host to develop or evolve mechanisms in place so that the symbiont is more reliably transmitted every generation instead of relying on this sort of, oh, I'll find it this generation, next generation, I may not find the right bug. So I think these are really important questions that we need to answer if we want to understand what's happening in nature in terms of host microbe symbiosis, particularly these ones which are kind of all over the place. I'll end by thanking everybody who's been really, really important for this work. So as you can imagine, I showed you many, many years of work by many, many people. And so they're all here on this slide. But I want to particularly highlight Pratibha, who's now a senior scientist in the lab and has worked not only on the rice phylosphere system, but also managed to pull together this beetle microbiome project, which many, many people have worked on with her. And so I'm really thankful for her and her effort and tenacity for this project, which has taken us years to figure out. I also want to thank our facilities and technical help, without which we would not be anywhere, and our funding sources and my host, my institute, NCBS, which is a wonderful place to work. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.